Picture Manhattan the way it looked in the year 1 AD. No roads, no bridges, no skyline. Just a 13-mile island of dense oak forest, granite ridges, freshwater streams, and salt marsh, rising from the cold collision of two rivers where the Hudson meets the Atlantic tidal currents of the upper bay. From above, if you could hover above it the way a hawk does, riding the thermal off the schist bedrock, the island is dark green and almost perfectly wild. Beaver work the streams. Oysters the size of a man's forearm cluster on every submerged rock in the harbour. Atlantic sturgeon push upstream through the tidal currents, some of them 6 feet long, ancient and slow and indifferent. The air smells of pine resin and salt water, and the particular cold, clean smell of a continent that has never been burned or ploughed or paved. There is not a single building on this island. Not a fence. Not a road. Not a wall. Just trees, granite, marsh, and the smoke of cook fires from the camps of people who have been living here for 10,000 years and who call this place Mannahatta, the island of many hills. Welcome to Mystique History. Did you know that before the skyscrapers, before the gridded avenues, before Ellis Island and Times Square and the Brooklyn Bridge, Manhattan was a landscape of such extraordinary natural beauty and biological richness that the first Europeans who sailed into its harbour were rendered temporarily speechless? And that beneath every street, every subway line, every foundation of every glass tower in modern New York, there are layers of 10 millennia of human civilization compressed into the bedrock like pages in a book that nobody bothered to read. Let me explain. The Lenape were the first New Yorkers. That is not a metaphor or a political statement. It is straightforward archaeological fact. Human beings arrived in the region of what is now New York City approximately 9,000 years ago. Drawn by the extraordinary natural resources of the harbour ecosystem.
It is good that we are all here together.
The Lenape, whose name in their own Algonquian language means simply the common people, were not a single unified nation but a confederation of related groups sharing language, kinship structures, and a worldview that understood the land as something to live within rather than something to own.
We are merely its caretakers.
They called their homeland Lenapehoking, a territory spanning roughly what is now New York, New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, and northern Delaware. The particular group living on and around Manhattan Island were the Munsee, one of the three main divisions of the Lenape people. Manhattan, Mannahatta in the Munsee dialect, means the island of many hills. It was not merely a name, but a description. The island's geology is a product of the last glacial period, when a retreating ice sheet scraped the underlying Manhattan schist into a series of ridges and valleys, left deposits of glacial moraine across the southern tip, and carved the Hudson's Valley so deep that it became a tidal estuary, navigable by ocean-going vessels all the way to present-day Albany. The same hard schist that gave the island its rugged topography would, 400 years later, provide the bedrock foundation for the heaviest concentration of skyscrapers ever built anywhere on Earth. The Lenape understood none of this geology consciously, but they read it perfectly in practice, settling the island's coves and inlets for their access to fresh water and shellfish, moving seasonally between coastal camps in summer and inland hunting grounds in winter, burning sections of forest deliberately to maintain the open meadows that attracted deer and other game. The trail they wore between their settlements along the island's spine would, in time, become Broadway. Their longhouses, communal structures housing multiple families beneath curved bark roofs, stood near what is now Washington Heights and Inwood, at the northern end of the island where fresh water springs were abundant and the narrowing of the Hudson made canoe crossings practical. The Lenape had no cities, no writing, and no concept of land ownership in the European sense. What they had was an intimate, 10,000-year-old knowledge of exactly one of the most geographically extraordinary places on the surface of the earth. They had watched that harbor, fished those oyster beds, burned those meadows, and buried their dead in that schist for 100 generations before anyone in Europe knew this island existed. The first European to see it was the Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano, sailing in the service of the French crown, who entered New York Bay in April 1524.
Anything like it. It is a new world.
His letter to King Francis I describes the harbour in terms of almost feverish admiration. A vast protected bay, a magnificent river, a people in canoes who came out to meet his ship with what he interpreted as cautious welcome. Verrazzano spent one night at anchor in the Narrows and then sailed north without landing.
Hold fast the sheets! Mind the wind!
He was followed 85 years later by an English navigator named Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch East India Company aboard a small vessel called the Halve Maen, the Half Moon. Hudson was not looking for a new continent. He was looking for a western passage to the spice markets of Asia. He found neither spices nor a passage to the Pacific, but he did sail his small ship north along the river that would bear his name as far as present-day Albany, and he filed a report with his Dutch employers that mentioned, almost in passing, the extraordinary abundance of beaver in the river valley. That single detail, beaver pelts, which were fantastically fashionable in Europe for hat-making, changed the history of North America. The Dutch West India Company arrived in force in 1624, landing their first settlers on Governor's Island at the mouth of the harbour in May of that year. They were a deliberately diverse group: Walloons from the Spanish Netherlands, French Huguenots, Dutch Reformed Protestants,
See how well this holds the fire.
and a number of others who had converged on Amsterdam seeking a fresh start. Within 2 years, the company had moved the main settlement to the southern tip of Manhattan, where the deep waters of the harbour allowed ocean-going ships to dock, and where the confluence of the Hudson and East Rivers provided natural defence on 2 sides. They began laying out a fort, Fort Amsterdam, on the site of what is now the United States Custom House in Lower Manhattan, and around that fort a small wooden town began to grow.
Ready before the next tide.
In 1626, a Dutch official named Peter Minuit formalized a land transaction with the Lenape that Dutch records describe as the purchase of Manhattan Island for 60 guilders worth of trade goods, an amount that later mythology would crystallize into the famously absurd figure of $24. Modern scholars are clear that the Lenape almost certainly did not understand this as a sale. In the Lenape conception of land, which was rooted in use rights rather than permanent ownership,
We will trade furs for it.
what they likely understood was an agreement to share the land with these new arrivals,
We share them, we do not sell them.
who they had been trading with for some years and who had, on balance, been useful commercial partners. Letters from Dutch colonial records as late as 1660 document Lenape leaders specifically stating that they had sold only the use of the land, not the land itself, and expressing genuine bewilderment at Dutch insistence that they leave. The Dutch, who understood it as an absolute sale, disagreed.
Anyone who challenges it will answer to Fort Amsterdam.
This disagreement would eventually be resolved through violence of the kind that erased the Lenape from the island entirely within a generation. New Amsterdam in the 1640s and 1650s was a genuinely strange and fascinating place, a profit-seeking commercial entrepot that attracted settlers from across Europe and the Atlantic world in a way that no other colonial settlement quite matched. Its population included Dutch, Walloon, English, French, Scandinavian and German settlers, a significant community of Sephardic Jews expelled from Portuguese Brazil who arrived in 1654, enslaved Africans who had been brought to the colony from the beginning of Dutch settlement, free black people who had negotiated their freedom from the Dutch West India Company under various terms, and a fluid borderland of Lenape traders and diplomatic visitors.
This one is worth more than iron.
By 1643, the director of the colony reported that 18 different languages could be heard on the streets of New Amsterdam, a number so implausible that historians still debate it, but indicative of a genuine diversity that even contemporaries found remarkable. The town sat within a wooden palisade wall at its northern boundary, constructed to protect the settlement from English encroachment and Lenape retaliation for the violent excesses of the 1640s.
Now hurry, there is much work to do.
That wall, built along a line that is today called Wall Street, was one of the first permanent structures the Dutch built in New York and one of the last to go. Its name is the most ironic survival in American urban history. Then England arrived. In August 1664, 4 English warships sailed into New York Bay carrying soldiers and a letter from King Charles II, claiming the colony for the English crown. The Dutch Director General, Peter Stuyvesant, a famously irascible administrator with a wooden leg,
They have made a grave mistake.
who had ruled New Amsterdam with an efficiency that made him respected and a temper that made him despised, climbed onto the fort's ramparts and apparently intended to fight.
We will not yield this fort without a fight.
They have too many ships. We cannot fight them.
His own citizens petitioned him not to.
For the sake of the city, master.
They had no particular attachment to the Dutch West India Company, whose profits they had laboured for years to generate, and the English were offering generous terms.
As stipulated in this charter, all property and religious freedoms shall be honoured.
Existing property rights respected, freedom of religion maintained, Dutch language permitted, current residents confirmed as full English subjects.
Freedom and property rights, it is enough.
Stuyvesant read the petition, reportedly wept, and lowered the Dutch flag. New Amsterdam became New York, named for James, Duke of York, the king's brother, who had been granted the territory by royal charter before the English had even bothered to actually take it. The beaver on the city seal was Dutch. The name was English. The people inside were everyone else. Under English rule, New York grew steadily through the late 17th and 18th centuries as a commercial port whose extraordinary natural harbour made it increasingly central to Atlantic trade. By the time of the American Revolution, it was one of the largest cities in the 13 colonies, with a population approaching 25,000, a dense concentration of merchants, shipbuilders, artisans, and their enslaved labourers crammed into the streets radiating north from the tip of Manhattan. When the Revolution came, New York's loyalties were divided in ways that reflected its commercial character. The city had too much trade with Britain to be enthusiastically revolutionary, and its merchant class was deeply ambivalent. General George Washington fought the Battle of Brooklyn in August 1776, was outmaneuvered by a British flanking movement through a gap in his lines that a local loyalist farmer had helpfully pointed out, and was forced into a desperate nighttime retreat across the East River that he barely escaped. The British occupied New York for the rest of the war. When they finally left in November 1783, thousands of loyalist refugees left with them, many of them formerly enslaved people who had accepted the British offer of freedom in exchange for service, and who had every reason to fear what an independent America run by slaveholders would mean for them. For a brief moment between 1789 and 1790, New York was the capital of the United States. George Washington was inaugurated as the nation's first president at Federal Hall on Wall Street on April 30th, 1789, standing on a balcony above a crowd that had gathered in the streets of the same town where Peter Stuyvesant had once stomped his wooden leg on the cobblestones of Dutch New Amsterdam. The capital moved to Philadelphia, and eventually to the newly designed city of Washington. But New York kept growing regardless, because the harbour that had made it valuable to the Lenape, the Dutch and the English was making it equally valuable to the new American Republic. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, connecting the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, transformed New York into the commercial hub of a continent. Every ton of grain from the Ohio Valley, every barrel of timber from the Great Lakes forests, every pound of cotton from the southern plantations moving toward the export markets of Europe funneled through New York Harbor. The city's population, which had been 60,000 in 1800, passed 200,000 by 1830 and kept climbing. And then the immigrants came. They had always come since the first Dutch settlers arrived in 1624, but the mid-19th century transformed immigration from a steady stream into something more like a flood. The Irish famine of 1845 to 1852 drove over 1 million Irish to America, a huge proportion of them through New York Harbor, where they arrived weakened, desperate and penniless into a city that needed their labor desperately and treated them with contempt. German political refugees arrived after the failed revolutions of 1848. Chinese workers came from California after the Transcontinental Railroad's completion in 1869, left them without employment and facing intensifying violence. And through the 1870s and 1880s, a vast migration from southern and eastern Europe, Italians from Sicily and Calabria, Yiddish-speaking Jews from the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire, Poles, Greeks, Hungarians, Czechs, began flooding into New York at a rate that exceeded anything the city's infrastructure could accommodate. The Lower East Side of Manhattan became the most densely populated patch of land on the surface of the earth, its tenement blocks housing families of 7 or 8 in apartments of 2 rooms, its streets so congested that sunlight barely reached the pavement, its air carrying simultaneously the smell of pickled herring from street carts and horse manure from the cobblestones and garlic from every window. When Ellis Island opened as the official federal immigration station in 1892, it processed some 12 million people over the following 60 years, and up to 40% of modern Americans can trace at least one ancestor through that single processing hall in New York Harbor. It was against this backdrop, a city bursting at its seams, its population doubling every generation, its harbor choked with ships, its streets impossible with traffic, that the Brooklyn Bridge was proposed, designed, and built. The engineer John Roebling conceived the bridge in the 1860s as a solution to the impossible congestion of the East River ferry crossings, which were the only link between Manhattan and Brooklyn, then still a separate city. Roebling designed a suspension bridge of unprecedented scale, a main span of 1,595 feet, supported by 2 Gothic stone towers that would be, at 276 feet, the tallest structures in the Western Hemisphere at the time of their completion. He did not live to see his design built. He suffered a crushing injury to his foot on the Brooklyn waterfront while surveying the bridge site in 1869, contracted tetanus, and was gone within weeks. His son, Washington Roebling, took over. Washington then developed caisson disease, what we now call the bends, from working in the pressurized underwater chambers where the bridge's foundations were being sunk into the riverbed. He was bedridden for the rest of the construction period, directing the work through a telescope from his apartment window in Brooklyn Heights, while his wife Emily carried his daily instructions to the site. The bridge took 14 years to build, required the labor of several thousand workers from every ethnic community in New York: Irish, German, Italian, African American, Chinese, paying $2 to $2.25 a day, and ended at least 20 lives, several from caisson disease. It opened on May 24, 1883, and immediately changed the shape of New York forever, enabling the physical merger of Brooklyn and Manhattan that would be formalized in 1898, when the 5 boroughs consolidated into a single city of 3.5 million people, overnight the second largest city on Earth after London. The late 19th century also brought the skyscraper. Manhattan's geography made tall buildings not merely possible but practically necessary. A small, narrow island with no room to expand sideways, surrounded by water, with bedrock close enough to the surface in the lower tip and in midtown to anchor the foundations of buildings of extraordinary height. The invention of the steel frame construction technique in the 1880s combined with the perfection of the passenger elevator, made it technically possible to build upward rather than outward. The Flatiron Building went up in 1902 at the triangular junction of Broadway and Fifth Avenue, its narrow prow cutting through the Manhattan wind like the bow of a ship. The Woolworth Building rose to 792 feet in 1913, its neo-Gothic terracotta facade making it the tallest building in the world for the next 17 years. And then the 1930s arrived, and the skyline went insane. The Great Depression, which devastated ordinary American lives beginning with the stock market crash of October 1929, paradoxically accelerated the construction of some of the most visually spectacular buildings ever assembled. The Chrysler Building rose in 1930 with its stainless steel Art Deco crown catching the morning light above Midtown Manhattan, its architect William Van Allen having secretly planned the building's distinctive spire inside the structure's crown and assembled it in just 90 minutes to win a race with the competing Bank of Manhattan Trust Building for the title of world's tallest. He won, briefly. The Empire State Building surpassed it in 1931, rising to 1,250 feet in just 410 days of construction, a pace that required roughly 3,500 workers on site daily, the majority of them immigrants and their sons, including a large contingent of Mohawk ironworkers from the Kahnawake Reserve near Montreal, who had discovered a generational aptitude for high steel work, and would go on to build much of New York's 20th century skyline. These men walked steel beams hundreds of feet above the city with a casualness that terrified observers below, eating their lunches on open girders with their legs dangling over the Manhattan void. The city that all this construction was making glittered in a particular way in the years between the two world wars. Times Square at night in the 1930s was lit by more electric signs than anywhere else on Earth. The Great White Way, its nickname a reference to the blazing theatrical marquees that turned the Midtown Broadway corridor into something close to perpetual noon. Jazz moved north from New Orleans into Harlem through the 1920s, and Harlem in that decade became the center of an extraordinary cultural explosion, the Harlem Renaissance, in which African-American writers, musicians, painters, and intellectuals produced a body of work that redefined American culture permanently. Louis Armstrong played the clubs. Langston Hughes wrote the poetry. Duke Ellington played the Cotton Club. The music that came out of those Harlem blocks in the 20s and 30s is still the foundation layer of everything the world hears when it turns on the radio. Then, World War II. New York did not see bombs. The Atlantic was too wide. But the city felt the war in every other possible way. Its harbor became the primary departure point for American troops crossing to Europe, its shipyards worked around the clock, its factories converted to military production. Women took jobs that had never been offered to them before. Black workers migrated north in enormous numbers as part of the Great Migration, drawn by wartime industrial employment and the possibility of a life outside the suffocating system of Southern segregation. When the war ended in 1945, New York received its veterans back into a city that was physically much as they had left it but culturally in transformation. The GI Bill sent millions of veterans to college and suburban housing developments in Queens and Nassau County. The United Nations established its headquarters on the East River in 1952, making New York, already the financial capital of the world after London's displacement in the war, also the symbolic capital of the international order that the war had made necessary. By 1950, Manhattan at night from the air was a spectacle that no human eye had ever seen before anywhere in the history of the species. 8 million people compressed onto a small granite island and its surrounding boroughs, their windows blazing, their neon signs painting the avenues in color, their yellow taxicabs moving through the canyons of Midtown in rivers of light, the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building rising above it all with their stainless steel crowns catching the last of the western sun, while the streets below moved and roared and never ever stopped. The Lenape cook fires that once burned on this island left a carbon layer in the soil less than a meter beneath Times Square. The Dutch Palisade Wall that became Wall Street runs along a line where men in suits now carry briefcases at 8 in the morning. The schist bedrock that the last glacier scraped into ridges 10,000 years ago still holds up the foundations of every skyscraper. Manhattan has never been anything other than exactly what it has always been. An island so improbably suited to human ambition that ambition found it in every century and built everything it could, right on top of everything that came before. If this story hit something in you, and it should, because this is one of the most astonishing urban histories on the surface of the earth, 10,000 years compressed into 13 miles of granite and ambition and salt water, then subscribe to Mystique History right now. We do this every episode, every city, every layer. I'm your host at Mystique History, and I want to know, what historical event should I recreate next? Let me know in the comments.